Welcome everyone to another VITA Learning webinar. Today's speaker is going to be Peter Pizzi. Most of you know Peter. He's an excellent technician, master technician, owns his own laboratory, been a technician since 1984. Has a personal appreciation for training, for education. His sole purpose, seems to be that he wants to educate everyone. To be elevated in this industry, in this market, to be able to offer anything you desire to as far as treatment planning for the patient, helping your dentist out, elevating your own skills and so forth. He's a member of the American Academy of Aesthetic Dentistry, and he's a graduate recognized specialist mentor at the Coy Center for Dental Excellence. And he's a co-editor-in-chief of Inside Dental Technology. Now, today's webinar, it's going to be control and balance of translucency and opacity for multiple material options. This is a frequently asked topic about how do you decipher, how do you create different translucencies, opacities, balance that out. Today's program, everyone is on mute. So on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a panel that has questions. If you want to, you can go ahead and touch that question box, type in your question. I'm Jim McGuire. I will be able to help you out as far as the questions. We're either going to take some during the program or we are going to do it at the end. There is a Q&A at the end of each program so that we cover your questions as well. The recordings so far, have been recorded, the webinars. They are posted on our YouTube channel, VITA North America, the VITA Learning websites, and so forth. So you have access to go back and revisit, watch Peter as many times as you want, because he's a gentleman and a scholar as well as a great trainer. And then the CE, at the end of the program, you'll get an email bounce with a request. If you want CE, you'll need to respond to it, send it back to our education department. So that'll be coming from VITA North America Educational Department. And without further ado, what we are going to do is turn it over to Peter. So welcome, Peter. How are you doing?
Thank you, Jim. How are you? Good to see you and talk to you again.
Yeah, it's always good for sure.
I hear you Californians are doing well. You're a great COVID rate, and I'm excited to get back to Cali soon. So I'm happy to hear that.
That, and it's starting to warm up a little bit more, right? It's always warm here in Southern California, but getting a little bit better weather. It is a little humid in the last couple of days, but very nice. And yeah, they expect maybe mid-June is what the governor and caretaker of the state is saying.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. So I miss Cali and miss seeing people, and we're looking forward to it. So thank you for having me here today.
All right, and you are on the screen, and we are ready to go.
Great, thank you. Welcome everybody back. I appreciate you coming and spending some time with me again today. It's Tuesday, I think, and I'm in my office working as usual. So it's kind of nice to do these from the office. You might see some people walking around behind me. My whole team is here. The topic today is understanding opacity and translucency. And I think Jim was actually emphasizing the translucency. I'm going to probably emphasize the opacity more, because I think that's a little bit more of the need for us to understand. I will touch on the translucency aspects of it, but I think it's really about to really manage materials today and all the different options that we have. I think our knowledge of understanding how the opacities of materials works becomes more critical for me. So, and I say today because I think the challenges have changed over the years. Years ago, aesthetic cases were mostly PFM or veneer. Today we have everything from zirconia, several different types, to lithium basilicus, different types, and several other materials and new things coming down the pike all the time. So it's kind of interesting that I find what we lack the most is our basic understanding. So let's be clear that when we're talking about restorative, I always like to say, I always start talking about restorative from a restorative space point of view. And what I mean by that is, in full coverage dentistry, the way we've designed dentistry forever, from the beginning till now, whenever you deal with a substructure or restorative space, you're usually talking about 1.2 to 1.5 millimeters of space. And the reason these numbers are so important, and I'm sure many of you heard me throw this slide up or these numbers out so many times, is because you need to understand that everything we've done in dentistry has basically been designed around this parameter. So every ceramic material that's made, almost every restorative material, whether it's a monolithic material or a substructure material, they basically, or ceramic in general, which is really the biggest challenge, they've all basically been designed around filling this space, 1.2 to 1.5. Now, I think you know, in today's world, although we still do full coverage restorations and a decent amount of them, the real goal is minimally invasive. And that sounds great too, to have less tooth structure prepared, but it does present you with other challenges because all the materials have been designed to work in this 1.2 to 1.5 concept. And to be clear, that 1.2 to 1.5 concept is based off 1 millimeter of dentin and about 0.5 millimeter of enamel or translucence. So in the end, if you really think about that, and I think this picture in the center of the screen illustrates it the best, I'm going to usually be about 0.2 of a millimeter of translucence or enamel towards the cervical, working my way up to about 0.5 of a millimeter of enamel towards the incisal edge and middle third. Now, if you skip over full coverage and say, what about in veneer world? Veneer world works exactly the same for me. I need at least 0.2 of a millimeter up to about 0.5 of a millimeter. All I'm really restoring with right veneers is technically the enamel, unless I'm making color changes. And if I'm making color changes, then obviously I really need more depth and more space. Rule of thumb, 0.2 of a millimeter per color change in a veneer is the common sense of a rule that we normally apply. But again, for us, the real challenge is how do we put the materials in those spaces? And I think the other problem for us is that we don't always have 1.2 or 1.5. Sometimes we have a lot less. Sometimes we have a lot more. And it's funny to me that people think the less is the bigger challenge. I would say more is the bigger challenge. And the reason more space is the bigger challenge is because it's harder for us to manage the opacity inside the restoration. And I'm going to kind of explain how that works as we go through our time today. Let me also be clear and say, for me, I'm still feldspathic guy in the world, although I'm very digital. I still think the best of the ultimate restoration is feldspathic, whether that's a veneer or a full coverage restoration, anything that's layered, window, full veneer. I still think it's the most bang for the dollar, right? It's still the best, most minimally invasive from a tooth health point of view, and yet gives you the most value and aesthetics that you can create in very small spaces. So for me, they're still number one. The second after that becomes fully layered restoration. So whether it's metal ceramics, zirconia ceramic, lithium silicate ceramic. And then after that, the next level is kind of the more common level that we're using today. And I actually showed this in a lecture I did last, I think it was Friday or Saturday with the Aegis group, but it was interesting because this area on the top here is, I think, where I want to live as much as possible, even though some of this is more full coverage. The bottom group is kind of where our profession lives the most. And what I would say to the rest of my technician friends out there is that if we're living here, although there's some ease in the aesthetics of what we're doing, meaning that we're doing less layering and we're using more of the technology, it's great. And I do quite a lot of this in my laboratory. At the same time, it's also the most common throughout the profession. And I can tell you the multitude of phone calls that we get of new doctors wanting to work with us. Most of the questions we're getting asked about are in this first box, which is the feldspathic, the veneers, the fully layered, or having the ability. And what I would point out is really your understanding of how to do that is really the king. Right? It's not necessarily that you build up a full coverage crown and you use 2 powders or 30 powders. It's really about how you understand what those powders can do from an internal point of view, what optics they have as far as adjusting or absorbing or reflecting light, which is also always key for the materials, and your understanding of nature. What does nature look like optically? And I think that's how I really pick all my materials, is I'm always trying to figure out optically, and I'm not always right, by the way. I wish I could say every case was perfect. Not the case. Many times I look at it, something that I'm done, and I'm thinking, wrong material, wrong choice, wrong powders, wrong firing parameters. It could be a million things, but in the end, it's all based off optics of nature. Is that what we're trying to accomplish? And in nature, not only do you have light transmission, but you have opalescence and fluorescence, things that we have in ceramics. I would argue they're not as great as nature, but they're close. They're getting better and better every day. And especially with some of the newer systems that we're getting into, you'll see how that's better. What really is the most important for me in full coverage is, if I'm going to be doing full coverage, which I still do, either metal ceramic, zirconia, or lithium disilicate. Excuse me. For me, it's still the most important to get light transmission into the tooth. And I usually do that by reducing the actual subframe to allow more light into the tooth, and using ceramic margin material. That's a standard for me in metal ceramics and zirconia. I don't do it as much in lithium disilicate today, but the other two, 100%. So optically, I want to make sure that my materials look more similar to nature. And the reason I said I don't do ceramic margins in my lithium disilicates or silicates is really because I think optically they're getting better and better. This is the Serenity you see on the screen right now. I mill these, and the beauty of this is I can actually fit them back to the tooth or to the restoration. It's kind of in that resiny state, which is really nice. If you even go to the doctor and be tried in. But again, not the point for today. The point really for today is that optically how well they look. For the new Ambria material, which is again a lithium disilicate, and you're looking at it on the tooth optically. And the optical parts are for me that I really care about. So when it comes to lithium silicates and disilicates, I'm not doing ceramic margins, but every other material I am. And especially if I'm doing anything veneer-wise, that's all feldspathic materials. And that's kind of where you get the most amount of usage understanding material, especially in cases where there are zero space. Like this particular case as an example, I literally had 1 to 2/10 of a millimeter to restore that tooth, and it was a no prep veneer. And my friend Dane, Dr. Dane, did a great job with the photographs and so forth. But the point of it is, when you have little space, I have to really be rethinking through my powders and which ones I want to use and not use. So let's look at some restorative, and I'll start to explain where the opacity part comes in so importantly. This was a case that we redid, one of the doctors and myself here at Staten Island, Dr. Bernadette Sava. And what's interesting about this case is the patient presented with previous restorations. And you look at these restorations, and I think it's pretty obvious when you look at them and they have that PFM look. But is it really a PFM look, or is it really just a poorly layered restoration? Meaning that we didn't understand how to mask from the inside the metal that was there, or how to layer it with enough opacity on the inside to mask and allow the light to slowly come in from the translucent point of view to the inside of the restoration. So I don't blame this on the material choice. I really just blame it on our knowledge of how to utilize the material. Because in the end, we actually made this case in metal ceramic. Again, it was an upper and lower arch, and there wasn't much different preparations done except for Bernadette's beautiful cleaning up the preps and managing the tissue and the cord and all the normal things that she would do. But in the end, it was still a metal ceramic case. And I think you can see that there's a lot more depth, obviously a warmer color, more natural for the face of the person that we were trying to make. And it's nice to make these kind of warmer color cases. We don't get to make them often. I actually enjoy these. But my point is look at restoratively, look at the depth. And that depth doesn't come just because we put metal ceramics or zirconia or lithium disilicate. It comes because of our understanding of how to mask and allow light transmission from the facial point of view to the inside of the restoration. And I think whatever the material is, metal ceramics, it's the same challenge. Now, in this particular case, I don't want to say it's easier, but being that the fact that we had 10 or a full mouth of prepped teeth, so we're dealing with 1.5 millimeters, 1.2 millimeters, and that's what my metal ceramic materials were made to work in. So it's kind of ideal. It's kind of what should be the standard of restorative processes when you're in full coverage. When you get into different materials like zirconias or lithium silicates, that challenge changes, and it changes for several reasons. One, as we look at our cases, you can see that this person also had some previous work done. You'll notice there's a restoration on the number 7, and there's a restoration on the number 10, and they look like they might be zirconia or lithium silicate. I'm not even sure what they were. This case is a few years old now, but the point of it is you can see they don't work. It looks like number 9 is probably a monolithic restoration, maybe lithium silicate, and you see you're getting bleed through, so there's no opacity. You're getting the actual color, the preparation popping through. The discoloration on the 7, very similar. So management-wise, the space wasn't managed well, either from the prep design or from the understanding of the restorative options. So in this case, if we take a closer look, there's a lot of aesthetic challenges. I won't go into all of them today just for time, but obviously the gingival architecture is not where I want it to be. We're going to address that. We originally planned this case as a 6-unit case. And it was interesting because, again, not a functional lecture, so I won't go deep into this, but it turns out that the tips of the cuspids were the only actually home spot or area when the patient closed that the patient actually hit. And if we would have taken away those cuspid positions like we originally thought we were going to, we would have lost his whole occlusal table. So we decided to opt to not do the cuspid and treat this as a 4-unit case, which, by the way, I would argue is always better. My train of thought for aesthetic restorative, I always say is 2, 4, 8, 10, 12. I don't like doing 6s in general. I feel like it's not a great transition from cuspid to bicuspids. So I think we're always better off keeping the front 2 or 4, leaving the natural cuspids, or if you're going to restore the natural cuspids, then you need to go to at least the first or second bias, depending on the smile dynamics of the patient. Okay, so we're gonna do some crown lengthening on this patient from the 7 and 8 area, and we're going to start to reprovisionalize. So you can see some of the crown work was done here, very nicely done. I'm not sure if one of my doctors did this or was actually done by a periodontist. It might have been done by Dr. Stuart Fromm, if I'm not mistaken. But in the end, you're going to see that some of the teeth were already full coverage preps and fairly dark shading, where the other ones were minimally invasive. And this is why I think it's so challenging today, because although I don't want to say the first case it was easy, it wasn't. It was a full mouth, it was a difficult case, but the spacing in the end was the same. It was basically a full mouth of prepared teeth, and it allows me to do the most I can with any material that I choose. On a case like this, where I have to really match the rest of the mouth, it becomes more challenging. And also I have a lot of different spaces to work with. And your ability to understand this opacity here is going to be even more critical for us to make this case a success. So we'll provisionalize the patient. I wound up doing 5 restorations. I did a single unit on the lower, which I'll show you in a second. It wound up being 2 full coverage, zirconia backed. I used a more opacified zirconia at the time. It was the whiter zirconia from VITA, the opacified version. Today I'm using more of the ST. And then feldspathic veneer is next to it. So you can see how that worked out restorative wise on the cast. And intraoral, when we put them in, they all kind of blended fairly well. And there was one other restoration done on the lower, the number 26 here. You can see this is a zirconia fully layered restoration with a very dark prep shade. So why did I use the more opacified zirconia? Because I needed opacity to hide some of that dark prep shade behind it. And I think it's kind of ironic that as we develop new materials, we're always developing in the more translucent world. Nothing wrong with that. We need that, especially for monolithics. But also, again, our job is to know when we need opacity. And in this case, I needed the opacity, not the translucency. So you can see this case is a lot more challenging for that, because I had to mask certain amount of dark prep. I had to work in very small areas, and yet I had to make them all work together. Again, opacity was the key. So I won't walk you through the patient just for time, and I'll go into the third case, and then we'll really start diving into the opacity. So this is where it becomes even more critical, right? First case, plenty of space, easy for me to manage. Second case, a little more challenging because I had more different spatial relationships to work with. Third case, I'm dealing with no tooth, in essence. I'm dealing with an accident victim who actually fell off a motorcycle, smashed his face on the floor, broke his front teeth. And you can see here that this is going to be a challenge. I know most people see this case and think, oh, we're going to extract the tooth or we're going to prep a 360 and post-core it. We don't think that way today in dentistry. We actually think that if you didn't destroy the tooth functionally, we're going to save as much of the tooth structure as possible. And that's really the goal. I don't want to weaken the tooth by cast posting, coring it, or changing, root canaling it more than it's already been done, to be honest with you. It's already self-root canaled by smashing it on the floor. But the last thing we want to do is start hollowing out that root and taking away more tooth structure. But challenge for us now. How do you manage that space? And this probably is the most difficult thing to understand. Opacity is that's 5 millimeters of unsupported ceramic that's going to be there. Aesthetically, the challenge is what ceramic do you put there? And I know most of you are thinking, well, this is where opaque dentins come in, and this is where other materials that have a lot of opacity come in. I'm going to restore this feldspathically, by the way, which I believe was the best option for this case because I have 0.2 of a millimeter facially on those preps, but I got 5 millimeters everywhere else. And the challenge is, what material would you pick to do that? If you chose a lithium disilicate or lithium silicate material, you realize that at the very thinnest area, it's going to be very, very translucent. But at the very thickest area, it may not be as opacified as you need, because you still have to set it up like a dentin structure, and that becomes a little challenging. So I wound up treating it feldspathically. And in this particular case, it's an older case, it was actually a VM9 case. I used EC1, which was our effect chromo one, which is very white. But I'm going to be honest and tell you, EC1 on its own, the very white opacified material, wasn't enough, because I'm going to make it such very thin, and you'll see a view of this, I think, from the incisal edge that I shoot. Yeah, so if you look down from the incisal edge, you can actually see it's almost nothing. It comes to a point. Well, even my most opacified material won't be opacified the thinner it gets. So I actually modified the material by putting some fluorescence in it. I actually put a little bit of a very fluorescent stain in there, and I mixed it in with the powder and then built up that little core. Why? Because the fluorescence is going to help me to reflect more of the light even in very thin areas. And I think that becomes a real critical process for me to understand how I'm going to manipulate the light. At that point, then it's a simple build-up, right? I wound up using just really translucent dentins, my TV dentins, a few little enamels, enamel material, very simple build-up at that point, because really the key was just to replace what was missing from that top half of the tooth. And if you look to the right of your screen, you'll notice light transmission-wise, how well that kind of works, right? Because one tooth I have only maybe 2.5 millimeters of restorative, where the other tooth I have 5 millimeters of restorative. And I'm managing the light to be the same because of the opacity on the internal aspect, not because of how much translucency or other materials I'm putting on the outside. That's why I said I wanted to focus on the opacity. Very similar case. I did this one with the newer ceramic, the Lumex AC. This is actually one of the first cases I did with it. I think maybe the second case. In a very same scenario, young girl fell off her bike, broke her 2 front teeth. She's only 15, 16 years old. We're not going to prep those teeth down. You wouldn't want to do that if it was your daughter by any means. So we have to restore. And again, it's about my knowledge now of understanding that opacity from the inside and how to restore those. So I used my new Lumex AC kit for this. And the beauty of this is actually, you know, it's funny when I see this picture, I'm not sure why the doctor packed cord here. He didn't need to. We're not going to restore anywhere near there. We're only restoring the areas that are missing, but it's kind of funny. So these are going to be treated as refractory dies, and I'm going to lay them as full veneers, micro veneers. But here's kind of the beauty. So I told you on the first case, I used my effect chromo or opacious dentin in essence for you guys who don't use VITA products. But I had to mix in some fluorescence, right? I took a fluorescent staining powder and actually mixed that in because I wanted that little bit of extra fluorescence. Well, I said the advancements are making things better for us. Now I have the ability to actually have more fluorescent powders in some of the newer kits, like the AC kit, where I actually have an ivory fluorescent flow dentin, they call it, which is more fluorescent. It's not technically more opacified, although I think the company would tell you it is really the fluorescence that makes that opacity change. So again, I could use 1 or 2 little powders now. I don't have to do any mixing. It makes life a little easier for me. Then I'll go to a dentin material, a water drop for a little bit of a translucency around the interproximals, my translucence. And then I'm just going to finish that with my normal dentins, either light, medium, depending on what kit you're in, or ENL or END, depending on the ceramics that you're in. And in the end, these two little window chips are managed about space. And this is a perfect example to me of what I've been trying to say for these first few cases. Look at how thin the area is up around the cervical, up around where the tooth, the interface will meet, and look at how thick it is and yet opacified it is in the areas where I need it to be. And again, that's about me making that opacity from the inside, not from the outside. So we'll place those in the patient's mouth, we'll bond them in, and it worked out fine. Young girl, I'm sure we'll be restoring those again at some point, but for today, that worked great. And I think it's a nice solution, but it only works if you really understand the powder system. So let's talk about the optics of the powders and get into the opacities. I'm going fast as usual. I'm trying to squeeze in a lot. Sorry about that. Plus, I'm on my 5th cup of coffee, by the way, so that makes it even faster. So when I talk about color, I always break it down the same way. I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this before. I talk about a canvas concept where I actually always want chroma in the cervical area, value in the middle third of the tooth, and then the age of the tooth is really about that incisal edge effect, how old or young the patient is, how much translucency or how much effect you want. And that's really pertinent to the case itself, not necessarily a standard build-up for me. I look at that canvas that I've designed over these last 15 years of teaching. Why? Because that's what nature has done. Nature works the exact same way. Chroma, value, and age. So because of that nature path, that's what I've always tried to follow. And I think I've spent my last bunch of learning years trying to figure out how to emulate nature as best as possible. The flaw with this, though, is I think where sometimes the manufacturers miss it, is they're giving us simplified formulas. You need a millimeter of dentin, a half millimeter of enamel, but they're not really compensating for the fact that very rarely do you work in 1.2 to 1.5. Like I said, you're usually working in less or more. It's very rare that you have the opportunity to have perfect spatial preparations. Yet your job is the same: to manage the chroma in the thinner or thicker areas, to manage the value in the thinner or thicker areas, and then obviously to transition from where your restoration or prep ends and where the final restoration will be, which is really the most difficult area for me. So I manage it the same way all the time through my powder system. And that powder system is usually a dentin with more chroma, a dentin with more value, and then transition materials, either bluish type enamels, so water drop or EE9, depending on which system you're in, or whatever your bluest ceramic is in your kit. But I might mix that with a little bit of a dentin sometimes if I don't want it to be overly translucent. So it really depends. Again, that's age related for that last incisal edge finish. Then I usually use mamelon materials, almost always. Very few cases that I don't use some sort of a mamelon material today. And that's really just to help the transition in this area, but it's also to create more different light optics because the mamelon materials are much more opacified, usually slightly fluorescent, and it helps me in very small areas to manipulate light a little bit more. It makes it a little bit more natural looking for me. After my first kind of layer of materials, I'm usually start doing some sort of mixing. I don't usually go straight to enamels. A lot of times I take a dentin and add in, if it's in Lumex AC, it might be the Sun Intense. If it's VM9, it might be my EE3, depending, or EE2, maybe even EE5 or 6, depending on the shading of the color that I'm looking for. The other thing that I kind of tend to do very often is I'll take a dentin, usually a brighter dentin, and mix that with some sort of a whiter translucent. So that could be, example, maybe EE1 with 1M1 TD in the VM9 kit, or it could just be a B1 or an A1 dentin mixed with a little smoky white in the AC kit. But that's a kind of a very similar pattern for me because I want to get translucency in those areas as I'm starting to get closer to the surface, but I also want to keep the brightness up in those areas. Okay, and then when I get into the enamels, and I told you I'm kind of skipping the enamels a little bit today, but in the enamels, I treat them a little bit different. In the last slide or two, I'll address that with the enamel systems. I think I have a different take on enamels compared to the way most people teach them. So I really want to stay more focused on the internal right now, but I do use obviously lots of different enamels, whether it's opals or just pure translucent. Again, it really depends on what you're looking to achieve, and I'll explain that more in the last few slides. But in the end, the concept is the same. Chroma, value, age, transition, always the same. That doesn't change for me. All that changes is how bright or how warm I want the case to be. So if I'm looking for a 1M1 case, I want to make sure that I'm using maybe 1M2s or 2M2s or even 3M2s in the cervical, and then jumping to the white or brighter in that mid-third, and then the age and translucent. If I'm building an A4 or 5M2, well, I'm probably using the A4 or the 5M2 and even mixing in more chroma to it, either through stain or something to make it more intense, because I always want to push the boundaries either in the chroma area or the value area, especially when the space starts to get limited. And you can see with the buildup that I did here, that you have a fairly nice transition, and you have all the things that I talked about: chroma, value, and age of the tooth. Some translucencies, not tons. Look at it in a black and white, and you kind of get a feel for the values there and how the value pops up in that middle third. And I always say teeth are really more about density than they are about anything else. I think it's a word we don't use enough. So if you notice the teeth on the left, the older looking teeth, well, what did I do to make them look older? I didn't change my buildup. It's still chroma, value, and age. It's still the same concept to me. The only thing that's changed is how much opacity is inside and how much translucency is on the outside. For younger teeth, I tend to want more opacity but brighter on the inside and slowly get more and more translucent. For older teeth, I want that same opacity inside, but I don't want it to get translucent so quick. I want to slow down the translucent process, because I don't want the light getting all the way inside the tooth like I would with younger teeth. I want to kind of keep a, let's say, a deader look or a more densified look of the tooth structure. So it's really no different in the buildup. It's just switching around the powder systems that I'm using. So remember that I said the powders are basically made to work in 1.2 to 1.5. What you're looking at on your screen here would be either a liner material or opaque material. The next one would be your dentin material, and that's usually about 1 millimeter in thickness. And then you'd have a translucent material, and that's anywhere from 0.2 of a millimeter to 0.5 of a millimeter. And those are the same concepts no matter what system you're using. When you put the three of them together, you basically get the shade that you're looking for out of the bottle. So if it's 1M1, you use a millimeter of 1M1 dentin and a 0.5 millimeter of the propylene enamel. That's what you're going to get, is about a 1M1. Again, the flaw, how often do you have that exact same scenario to work in? And can you really get everything you need from two powders? I would argue no. You're going to need more. You're going to need other dentins to increase value, or other materials inside to lower value and get a little bit more chroma aspect in some of those areas. So I manage that space the same way, and I manage it by understanding the opacities and translucencies of the materials. I think I have to say one of the things that's probably one of the nicest about the AC is how well of a job they did trying to manage what you see. So it's funny, I said this in Chicago last year or the year before, I don't remember, but whenever I start working with new systems, one of the first things I always do is fire shade tabs about a millimeter thick, and I glue them to the top of the bottles. And as I was doing that, I was thinking, you know, it's always good for me to see the color as I open my drawer and look at it. And then I realized they did that for me already, so I don't need to do it anymore. They actually came up with a great color scale system that shows you whether it's more opacified dentins, fluorescent, or translucent, and a rough concept of what the color is right on the jar. So it's kind of a much better way. I'm not a numbers guy, meaning that I don't really think about, I want more of this one, I want more of that one. I actually think more about, I want more amber, I want more yellow, I want more white. And I like to relate more to the colors than just the numbers on the bottle. And it was always helpful for me to see the little tabs on top of the bottle. Now it's helpful for me to see the opacities and the color scheme. So I think hats off to the VITA company for doing that and putting it together and naming the products with some cooler names like Water Drop and Azor and colors that didn't sound goofy to me. So I appreciated that too. But in the end, the system is made as a system for you to make life easier. And although I don't want to talk about really the system, I want you to understand the opacities of the system. So this particular system is a little more opacified than the VM9. If you guys were VM9 users, it's still less opacified than some of the other products that are out there. So if you're a creation user or a GC user, I'd say those are still a little bit more on the opacified side. But the AC brought a little closer of an in-between, I think, between the middle of them, which is kind of a good spot to be. And if you compare the difference, so let's say the base Dentin in the VM9 as compared to the opacious Dentin, much more opacified. So we're going kind of backwards in some ways, working with more of the opacious materials. I don't consider it backwards. I look at the Chroma Pluses in the VM9 or the ECs as mild opacious Dentin. That's kind of the way I've always seen them. We tend to get used to saying opacious Dentin, so it seemed like maybe it was a better way just to call it opacious Dentin rather than confusing people. But in the end, because I'm slightly more opacified, it gives me a little bit more range to work in the materials. And I wanted you to notice that I said when you add fluorescence to the material, how it really changes the opacity of it. And it changes it because of the optics that happen when light hits the fluorescent materials and becomes more reflective. So what's nice about that is it seems like it's a more opacified material. I would argue that it's not necessarily more opacified, but it is definitely appearing more opacified in a light perspective or an optic perspective. So if you see the same chart now, when I go to the flow intensive materials that are in the AC kit or the Mamelon materials, look at how much further towards the opacified area they are as compared to where everything else is from enamels or dentins or opacious dentins. And again, those areas to me are kind of the kings and queens of the kits that we work in. And I usually explain that by saying that when I'm putting those powders together, I want to really understand which powders do the most for me. And the best example that I've used many times before is the chess game. When you look at a chess game, you're looking at the entire board, and the best chess players have the ability to know the value of each piece and what they can and can't do. And for us to be great ceramists, I think that's really the key, is we're always working towards trying to understand what materials gives us the effects that we need. And in this case, I feel like the fluorescent materials are really the ones that do that, whether they're liners, margin materials, flow dentins, or even Mamelon materials, which are also highly fluorescent. To me, those are what I would kind of call the queen of the kit. They have the ability to do the most in the most amount of space or the least amount of space. So that's why they're really the queens of the kits for me, and they really add a lot internally for us to work through. Our job really is kind of simple. I like to simplify it. In the end, 95% of the time, I'm finishing my restoration with some sort of translucency. Internally, I'm looking for some sort of opacity. Now, the challenge is what happens in the middle of those spaces, and that really depends on if I have 1 millimeter or 5 millimeters to deal with. But I do need to have the same parameters. I need something opacified inside and more translucent towards the outside. Standard, it's kind of the way that works for me. So what I want you to do is really understand that when we talk about the materials at 1 millimeter thick of dentin that we have, the question that I've asked everybody a billion times is, what's the opacity of your dentin at 1 millimeter thick? And most people don't know that. I'm sure some of you have studied with me before, have some numbers in your head now. And I think that's important, because if I take 1 millimeter of dentin and I actually shine light on it, look at how much light actually goes through the dentin. A lot of it. And actually, I would tell you that sometimes it's about 60 to 70%, depending on which material you're using, which company's material you're using, and how you fire it, because that plays a role if you over or under fire the material. But based on that concept of working with about 1 millimeter of thickness, and by the way, I want to be clear, the firing parameter is so critical. I can't tell you how many labs I go into around the country, around the world for that matter, in the good old days, that I watch them fire their restoration. They spend all this time trying to build a beautiful restoration, and they put it in their furnace and they fire it 20 degrees over what it should be, or slightly under. Most of them fire over, very few fire under the temperature. And ceramic is like any other product. It's really about the maturation and how you understand how to fire that in the furnace and the time it takes to bring that up to temperature and get the most maturity out of the ceramic without over firing it and turning it into a glassy matrix. So managing those parameters and those temperatures are so critical for me. And that's why I think I always stress the importance of firing in quality furnaces and really being very aware of the properties of what ceramics should look like and how it feels for you when you're grinding on it and looking on it. These areas are probably most important in single central world. I showed this case before, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, except to say that all I'm really doing with very little space to work in is managing my opacity and fluorescence internally. And I actually did that by using margin materials. So I'm actually using very fluorescent margin materials to build up this inner lining or structure. And then after that, it's a simple dentin buildup, very small dentin buildup to achieve the density and opacity that I need to hopefully make this tooth match as well as it can. And you see as I slide that in the patient's mouth, it kind of harmonizes fairly well. It's got a very similar density, and that's important. Color-wise, I have the zones of chroma, value, and translucency. And the only way to really test yourself at the end is under polarized, right? Take that polarized shot, and you can see that we got a really fairly nice value match and chroma match across the board. And that's what really matters. It's not cemented yet at this point, but you can see that that's what we're getting out of it. So let's dive into the ceramic a little bit more and talk about how this opacity is so important for you. I always say color starts from the inside. And I know that's a challenge for us today because a lot of our restorations are color on the outside. A lot of the monolithic restorations that we're doing, stain and glaze concepts, and I know that's so typical. And by the way, I stain and glaze too. Of course, we have certain cases and doctors that we do stain and glaze molars for. And let's be honest, they're getting better and better looking. So I'm not poo-pooing stain and glaze and monolithic molars at all. But I do want you to understand that if you really want to create depth, that depth comes from the inside and working from opacity to translucency. So the example that I use all the time, which is kind of the best example, I think it's an older example, is I've taken 3 substructures and I've coated them with either opaque or liner material, depending on what system you want to use, doesn't matter, but let's just say opaque for now. I have one with A1 opaque, one with A2 opaque, but 3 or 4 other little modifications, a little violet, a little chroma. Then I have a third one, which is what I would call standard in my office. So if we opaque, we're doing metal ceramic, or if I'm using zirconia and I want to get coloration, this is kind of the standard colorization for me when I start a case. And you can see there's a lot going on there. Why? Because I'm looking at the same things that I looked at before: chroma, value, and translucencies. And I want to make sure that I'm getting all of those the same way. The example that I used a few years back to show this was I took a monolithic press 2 restoration. So there was no color in the actual material that I'm going to put over those copings. But I want you to notice the difference when I put the same material over all 3, how much different they look. And the reason they look different is basically because there's different coloration inside, which means the light is passing through the material and hitting whatever that substructure is, your natural tooth, whatever opaque or liner material that you put on there is really what's giving you way more color than you realize. And again, look at this from the occlusal point of view. You can see a big difference. I'll put a dot or 2 stain in there, yeah, but look at the difference in the warmth that's being generated inside the restoration. And that becomes really critical for us to kind of manage through that process. So to prove it, I took the same ingot that I had pressed and I cut one in half. And just to show you that there was no color in that ingot, and I put half of the ingot back on the substructure and I pressed it again so you can kind of get a feel or a look at what it looks like. And this is always one of my favorite slides to show. Look at how the coloration from the substructure is actually bleeding up into the ceramic material. Remember, that's one ceramic material, right? It's basically one opacity, one color, yet I'm still getting all that coloration to come through there. Okay, so now if you start to look at the coloration here, you look at the difference and how that really works, right? Look at the color that's actually shooting up inside the tooth. And you can see that this is all coming from internal, not from the outside. So this is where when we talk about staining glaze can look beautiful. It can, but can it look as beautiful as this? Definitely not. The color comes from the inside, and that's where the light and the value comes from. And even from a value point of view, if we actually look at this, something I've showed a billion times, 2 shade guides. One of them has a white opaque behind it. One has a 3 opaque behind it. And look at the difference in the brightness of the same A1 Dentins. Both of them are A1 Dentins. And at the same time, both of them have the exact same, completely different values. Both of them have the exact same values in them, even though that they are they both, I'm sorry, completely different. I got distracted, somebody walked in. Both of them have completely different values in them, even though they have the exact same dentin in them, right? So it shifts value just by how the light from the inside is transmitting through the outside. So I always say value is really about the absorption of light or the reflection of light more than anything else. So the best example that I can give you for that is really to understand the opacity inside. Is I built up a case a while ago, and this is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Remember, cases are all about space. And when we're dealing with the space, I told you that from a space point of view, if we're going to utilize exactly what the manufacturer said, which is usually opacious dentin, opaque or liner, opacious dentin, dentin, enamel, in theory, that sounds great. But I would argue that if you look at this schematic of what we're supposed to do, does that really work well for you as a ceramist when you look at that? What do I mean by that? Well, can you really put opacious dentin that thin and have it do something for you? And the answer I would give you is no, because the opacious dentin is only as opacified as the thickness that you're using it. The thinner and thinner I get with it, the less opacity I have with it. That's why when I made those 2 first cases where I had to use my opacious dentin to really extend, I used something with fluorescence in them to modify them a little bit and make them more opacified. And that was really the goal. So here's what I'm going to do here. If you look at the materials, opaque is 100% opacified, so it doesn't allow anything to go through it. Liners are not, although if you use them thick enough because of their fluorescence, they appear very opacified. Dentin, about 0.8 of a millimeter, is usually only about 32 to 35, 38 units of opacity. That means that 60 to 70% of the light actually transmits right through it at 1 millimeter thick or an 0.8 of a millimeter thick. So you can see here how I see the white background, the black background, and the blue background. And opacious dentin. When you use opacious dentin, you're normally using it at 2/3 of a millimeter. Well, that's the opacious dentin at 2/3 of a millimeter. It looks more translucent than your dentin. It's not giving you what you think it does. And the only way to change that is either by changing the opacious dentin to something that has a much higher chroma or value content to it, or by modifying it with some stains and different materials. Now, I modify them a lot, or I just choose different ones. And this is kind of the best example I could think of for you to really understand the internal opacities of the restorations. So let's take these 2 units. I have 2 zirconia units. You can see that I've done pretty much nothing to them. They're just kind of cleaned up, no real coloration on them, nothing really, just the normal 2 units, right? What I'm going to do with those 2 units is show you the amount of spacing that I have to work with. I have a nice amount of space, 1.2 to 1.5. So this is ideal. And if I'm going to build based on the manufacturer concept, let's see what happens. I'm sorry, I need to plug my laptop in. I didn't realize I didn't plug it in. Sorry about that. I just saw my little battery thing pop up. So think about what's going to happen. Now let's kind of walk through this, because this is kind of the meat of what I wanted to kind of explain to you in this lecture after rambling through all the other stuff. I think the opacity on the inside is really king. And whether you do it the way I do it with fluorescent materials, margin materials, or liners is one option. But another option that a lot of people tend to use is really just understanding how to create more opacity inside. And I want to show you why it's so important. So here's what I'm going to do. The goal on these two restorations are going to be to make them 1M1 A1-ish. So that's kind of the goal. So keep that in your brain. We're gonna go for a 1M1 A1 kind of a look. And I'm going to start by taking my Opacious Dentin material, and I'm going to use my Opacious Dentin material interproximal, cervically, and more up to the interproximal. I'm not going to put any on the tooth next to it. I'm only going to do it on the number 8 that's here, okay? But the material I'm going to choose might confuse you a little bit. I'm actually going to take A4 Opacious Dentin. I know I said A1 or 1M1, but bear with me, because remember, why would I want something so chromatic? And the answer is because I'm going to use it much thinner. So by increasing the chroma, I'm technically increasing the light absorption, which is going to make it appear more natural in the end. Second area that I'm going to want to work in is my value, right? So I always want chroma in the cervical. I want value here. Again, A1, 1M1, but I'm going to use B1 in this particular case. I'm using B1 because that's what I have in the kit. If I was using a different kit, I might use EC1, or depending on which kit you're using. But what am I really trying to do? Get something whiter and brighter. And the reason I want the whiter and brighter, because I want the most reflective index here. And I want to come up and down my line angles and get that whiter, brighter look of light reflection inside the tooth. And again, these are opacified materials. For those of you who know me, I don't normally use C and D shades. I'm kind of I'm of the belief that there really is no such thing as a C and D shade. And without going into a long diatribe, I won't explain that too much more at this moment, except to tell you that even though I don't believe in them, I don't utilize them very often. There are times where I might cheat and use a little bit of a C or a D shade. And the reason I would do that is really if I needed to have some sort of opacity, yet lower value. So in this case, I want to extend the tip of the coping. I don't want to put something bright there because I want it to look different from the brightness that's here. I also don't want it to have a ton of chroma to it. So believe it or not, an ideal material here for Opacious Dentin would be a C1, something that has a much lower value, but yet really contrasts with the brighter part of that middle third of the tooth. Then for the fun of it, just to add a little bit of color and throw a fourth one in there, I'd put an A2 or something, Opacious Dentin, or maybe an EC3. And why? I'm really just putting that in there for fun, just to create a little bit of a warmth in the incisal edge. I always like that little bit of extra warmth in that area. So that's kind of a basic Opacious Dentin buildup. Now, I use 4 powders to do that. Some of you say, well, that's more powders than I use in general. Some of you say, I get it, I need another 4 after that. I'm going to simplify it. I'm only going to use those 4 opacious materials. So here is the final buildup of that. And I'm actually going to fire that. But again, notice on the number 9, I've done nothing. I put no Opacious Dentin, no powder on it whatsoever. I'm only working Opacious Dentin on one of the restorations. Okay, and I'm going to fire that. And I hope you notice right away that as I'm firing it, you can notice how much the chroma is more intense interproximally and less intense as it comes down to the cervical. That's based on the thickness. So again, the opacity here is king, because the more I have, the more chroma comes out. The less I have, the less chroma is there. So why did I pick the A4 for an A1? Because it's going to give me the warmth I need without having to use a different material or put stain on the crown at the end. I want the color inside, not on the outside. Notice the brightness that you can see here, and notice how it transitions up. So that's an ideal internal structure for me, and I'll shoot it under a warmer light so you can really see the difference and the effect of it. Now let's go back to a normal buildup. I'm going to build the 2 units now with 1 dentin. I'm going to use A1 dentin or 1M1 dentin, whichever one you want. They're similar, not exactly the same, but similar. And I'm going to build it with just 1 dentin. But remember, on the number, the adjacent tooth next to it, I'm basically building that whole tooth with 1 dentin or A1 dentin, which means I'm going to have about 1 millimeter of dentin on that tooth. The tooth next to it, I've already built it with opacious dentin. I've used 4 different opacious dentins, which means now I'm only going to have about 0.6 of a millimeter to actually use my dentin with. So it's going to change the concept of the dentin a little bit. But I wanted to prove the point to you of how valuable it is to understand that opacity and how well it works for you. So watch. I'll finish up my dentin buildup, create a little bit of a mamelon structure, start putting a little translucency on this. In this case, it could be the water drop or E9, whichever one you're comfortable with. And then in the end, I'm going to finish that with 1 enamel. So realistically, it's a 2 powder buildup, 1 dentin, 1 enamel for 1 tooth. But the other tooth has 4 opacious materials underneath it. And I'm going to fire both of those. When I fired them, I felt the one was a little weak, so I actually went back and did a little tiny correction bake with a little bit more enamel just to finalize the contour. So I'll do that sometimes. Sometimes I get it perfect in the first bake. It really depends, but you get the idea. Now what I want you to notice, I've flipped these over, so I hope you don't get too confused. I should flip the other ones around. The number 8 is the one that has the opacious dentin materials behind it, and the number 9 is just the A1 dentin and 1 enamel. And I want you to look at those 2 teeth carefully, because I could tell you sometimes untrained eyes look at it and say, well, I like the 9 better. Do you? And the reason you usually do is because it looks more translucent to you. You think, oh, this looks better. It's so much more translucent. But remember, I was going for an A1 shade. And in an A1 shade, a lot of translucency does what? Lowers the value. I didn't get that opacity on the inside to support my dentin. Now watch if I put a shade tab next to these. This is an A2 shade guide. What do you notice the value on my A1 buildup? It almost looks lower value than the A2. Look at the value there. And this is what I hear a lot in the laboratories is our values are off or not, the color doesn't match the right way. It's only because you're not managing the space and understanding the importance of that opacity that's in there. So in the end, look at the difference, A2 tab next to my restoration. See how it looks like a nice A1? It has all the value and chroma and brightness that I want, yet the value never drops. And it doesn't drop mostly because I supported the value with the chroma inside. And that's why when Jim said we're gonna talk more about the translucency, I'm shifting that. You have to understand the opacity first. The translucency, I'm going to simplify it for you. And I'm going to tell you that the translucency is a little bit easier to manage, but it only really works if you understand the opacity internally first, and then start to understand how to use the translucency. So for me, opacity on the inside, again, options, margin materials, liner materials, flow dentins, opacious dentins, any of them work well. Just your concept of where to put them becomes king. As far as what Jim said I was going to talk about, which was the enamel system, I'm going to simplify that by saying if you really understand the internal, then all the enamel is doing for you is either filtering the light or allowing all the light to go through. Now think about that concept. If I use a very white enamel, a lot of the light gets blocked on the facial because the enamel is so white and it doesn't allow all the light to go through behind to what you see. If I use a very translucent enamel, well then all the light goes through the enamel and hits what you put behind it. And this is why for me, I usually pick my enamels first when I'm building a case and then fill behind it with what it's going to be opacified wise. So let me give you an example of that. This is an older buildup a long time ago. I've changed my build-up style so much, but it's an interesting shot to show because even back then when I was developing the concept, I was working with more opacity, more chroma value and translucencies and effects. What I want you to understand here is in this build-up is whatever I built is really the core of my restoration. And now I have the option of filtering that with my ceramic. So watch what I mean by that. So I've now put my ceramic over the outside of that as a veneer. I'm thinking of the ceramic more as a veneer. And if it's really translucent, it's going to show me everything that's inside. If it's really opacified, it's going to hide some of the things that are inside. So when I'm looking at cases and I'm trying to pick shading for teeth, I'm usually starting at looking at the enamel. Is it a really translucent enamel that I'm trying to match, or a more opacified whitish enamel that I'm trying to match? And today that's challenging because a lot of the patients are bleaching before you get to see them. and the enamel kind of seems a little more frosty than you'd actually like it to be. But in the end, this effect is similar. And if I join these two together, watch what happens. So let's go back again. I'm going to just walk through that slide one more time. Chroma, value, mammillon materials, and age. I cover that with a very translucent enamel and bond those two together. And you see how all the effects tend to work. My enamel is allowing me to see what's in there. It's allowing me to see the brightness, and it's allowing me to see the chroma at the cervical. So I simplify the two. For me, everything is about the internal opacity buildup and then finishing with the translucency or effect filtration that you need. And that works the same no matter what case I've done or how much space I have to work with. Like in a case like this, where I have zero space, right? A few tenths of a millimeter on the veneer, and you get a full coverage tooth with still minimal, maybe about a millimeter of space. And my job is the same, to manage the internal with my opacities and fluorescence, and then filter that down with my enamels in the end. So you're looking at two different materials, one very thin veneer, one zirconia restoration layered, and yet my job is to make them look the same as much as possible. More difficult, the more you mix the materials, but if you work in the same family, meaning zirconia layering with the same layering material for the veneer and manage the space the same, it becomes a lot more easy for us. So with that said, I'm pretty sure I'm just about on time here. Let's see. Oh, I'm almost a minute over. So I'm going to stop right here and say thank you to you guys for participating. If you have some questions, maybe Jim, you saw some questions or not, but thank you. Hope I didn't run over.
No problem, Peter. That was great stuff. And yeah, opacity inside out, sort of with the translucency. I like how you basically hide the translucency with opacity and filter it back and forth. Great stuff. And as we're taking questions, if anybody else has additional questions, please submit them. So this is a first question. Do you change your facial texture and gloss by the age of the patient?
100%. Yes, that's a great question, actually. And whoever asked that, thank you. So it's interesting. The gloss that you refer to, so the doctors, we all call it glaze, right? And I say glaze is such a bad term. It's such an archaic term to me. Teeth have luster surface to them, and every luster of the tooth is different. Some have very high luster, some have a lower luster, some have a lot of texture, some have a little texture. I'll add to your question by saying texture actually can increase value because you get more light reflection. The example of that would be a clear piece of glass that you could see through, and I take sandpaper and grind on some of it, and I can no longer see through that area. Because of the roughened surface, the light reflection becomes different. So yes, more texture can increase, and as we age, we lose a lot of that surface topography, and your enamel demineralizes as you age and becomes more translucent. So the simple answer to your question is 100% yes. When I'm trying to get older looking teeth, like the density one that I showed you earlier in the lecture, I'm using more opacity on the inside and more pure translucent towards the outside. So I want you to see right into that density of the tooth. When I'm trying to build younger, higher value teeth, I'm still using lots of opacity inside, but I'm breaking it down slowly as I get to the outside. So the light has more depth to penetrate into the opacity, and that's how I keep the value up. And then of course, how you polish and luster that tooth at the end will play a huge role in the final. It's a great question, thank you.
Do you always glaze, or do you sometimes just polish?
I always glaze, but I'll be honest with you, I almost feel like it's goofy sometimes that I glaze, because I wind up glazing and rubber wheeling the whole thing kind of away anyway. I glaze with a different perspective. For me, I glaze because if there's any microporosities or anything on the crown that I'm not really seeing with my eye, I'm really using a glaze, a very thin paste, or sometimes powders that I'm kind of flushing on my tooth, and I'm really doing that to fill all the microporosities and keep it more sealed. But at the end, I'm going to break a lot of that glaze away, and then I'm going to polish the surface.
All right. And then Kyle has a question. When using the Lumex, or really doesn't matter much, but what are you sealing the refractory dies with? Do you know what the?
Yeah, so I seal all my refractory dies for any ceramic. I'm using the GC connector paste. I think it's the only company that still makes that paste, to be honest with you. And I'll be honest, Kyle, I don't know I need it. I just do it out of habit after all this point. In truth, I think all the connector paste is kind of like a glazy type material that's firing at a higher temperature and bonding into that refractory dye. I've done them without it and it works just fine. I've also made my own mixes in times where I use like a fluorescent stain, like a white fluorescent stain, and kind of painted that on too. I don't know you 100% need it, but out of habit, I keep using it. So for me, I'm using the GC connector paste for it.
All right, and then Daniel has a question. A bright shade, a bleach shade, Ivoclar BL1, but in the VITA system, probably a 0M1/2. The patient wants that brightness, wants that bleach shade, but also wants depth and translucency. Is there a way to handle that?
Yeah, so here's where the challenge comes in, right? The whiter we get, the harder it is to keep our translucency. And I'm going to tell you sarcastically, when patients want super, super white and they don't really care about all the details, the chroma, the values, and the translucencies, you know what? Use the whitest enamel you have and cover the tooth, and you're going to be okay. Put any dentin underneath and use really white enamel on the outside, because what are they really looking for? White, bright, and reflective. But when you're trying to really make it look good, that transitional point is really about the depth. And I would start very, very bright inside. I think I said in my last lecture for VITA last week or the week before, I tend to only use 2 zirconias. I use the ST, but I'm pretty much either using white or A1. Those are pretty much the only ones I really use, once in a blue moon, the darker. And why do I want white? Because if I really want to get to an OM1 or an OM3 kind of a case, I want as much whiter brightness on the inside as I can have. And then as I filter out, I'm just getting more and more translucent. So I'm starting white. And the best example is if the doctor asked you for OM3, I start with OM1. I start even whiter and brighter, a white core, a white EC1, or maybe a very bright opacious dentin, and then even brighter dentin. And then my next dentin would get more translucent, but still similar brightness. Because you have to understand that the further out I go from the internal, the more translucency I have, the lower your value is going to start to come. So I'm going to always push the internal brightness and then just get more and more translucent towards the outside.
All right. On your mamelons, you mentioned mamelons, opacious dentin. Which one of those are more opacious in your opinion?
The mamelons are definitely more opacious dentin. Opacious dentins tend to fall in a scale of anywhere from 45 to 60 units of opacities. Mamelons tend to be anywhere from the 60s to the 80s, depending on what kit you use and their fluorescence. So think about what you could do with a mamelon. I could build up my canvas wall of ceramics, and I can actually paint mamelons on in microns, right? Not even a full 1/10 of a millimeter, and still get effect out of it. I couldn't do that with every opacious dentin because I would need more thickness. So you get more opacity and more fluorescence in the mamelon materials, definitely.
All right, thanks. So a couple kind of questions on halo effects. Do you use a porcelain or a stain to create your halos?
I use porcelain. I don't often stain for halo. And the only thing I would add to the question, 2 things. One, I know when I'm giving courses and hands-on, we address this a lot. So a few of you probably heard me talk about this before, but the halo is not the incisal edge of a tooth. I know that's what most people kind of classify it as. The halo is actually optically the surface that it surrounds the entire tooth. And the best example I always give is a bottle. If you take a clear water bottle, I'm looking around to see if I have one. I held up a clear water bottle. The bottle is clear, but you could tell where the edges are. Right? And how come you could tell where the edges are? because optically the material is a little different because it's either thicker or rounded or curved. So when we're talking about a halo, for me to create halo, I'm usually using a combination of either a dentin, a translucent dentin mixed with enamel. It's usually brighter and whiter. So if I'm building a 1M1, I might be using OM2 or even OM1 mixed with an enamel because I want to really create an opacified surface. But I also want you to be clear, it's not just the incisal edge, it surrounds the entire tooth, which means you usually need more than one halo material because cervically I want chroma, middle third I don't want as much, and then as I get towards the incisal edge is where I get the brighter and whiter. You can do it with stain, little on the cheaper side, I would argue, so try to do it with your powder buildup, it's better.
All right. Do you use the communicate opacity translucency? Do you use photographs, or do you always see the patient? How do you manage to visually conceptualize that translucency opacity for each patient?
So both. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have a few great local doctors that I work with. I think Bernadette's closest to me, and I probably see almost all of her patients, which is fabulous, and I love, and it really creates a great team environment. But I also work with doctors in different states and different countries. So that's the case. You don't have any ability to see them, although some of them have flown here over the years. But the bottom line is the photography is really king. And when I look at teeth, quality of the pictures, I usually offer photography courses for my doctors very often. Obviously, last year we didn't do any. I'm hoping to start some up again. Most of my doctors have really become pretty good photographers at this point and don't need me to see their patients anymore. Although I still like to see the patients. I like to break down color and make them understand teeth a little bit better. But in the end, good quality photography is king. And I know Jim is probably sick of hearing me talk about photography, but I always say
Never.
It's probably the most important thing in our profession that we overlook and push aside. That's where the communication comes in. So quality photography, if you can't take the pictures yourself, don't blame your doctor. Learn how to take them. Buy the right camera, buy the right system, and then teach your doctors. They'll be more partnerized with you than the other way around if you're just telling them the pictures are no good and you can't see it. And then as you get better photographs, the next challenge for you is to learn how to read. You know, remember when we were kids, they said reading is the key to life. Well, reading is the key to life for us, because if you can look at a picture and really, you know, it's funny, I look at a picture, I could tell in a second the quality of the camera the doctor used. I could tell if they used the right flash system. I could tell if the patient was in the chair or not. I could pick the picture apart in a second because I've gotten so used to seeing pictures that I read them like a well-written novel sometimes. And I think it's really important that we all have the ability to do that. So pictures are king.
All right. Like to hear that. I never always want to hear the photography end of it. It's good. It's great. So you showed a case that you mentioned violet, the 3 units. Did you use a stain or opaque or in between, or how'd you do the violet?
All of them. So be clear that violet on the color spectrum is one of the more absorbent colors. So it tends to absorb the light wave, and that's why violet is a great area. If you look at some stains that have that violety hue to them, that's really their purpose. It's really about being able to absorb light. From a color spectrum, violet absorbs well. When do I use violet? So if I'm doing metal ceramic crowns, I always use a violet around the halo of the coping itself, or the tip of that coping. And that's really just to hide the transition and stop that halo effect or that white headlight effect that you get. If I'm working with zirconia or lithium silicate, I do the same thing. I may do it slightly different. In the opaques, I use violet opaque, which comes with my opaque kit. Some of them have it. If not, I might take it from a different kit. It doesn't matter. In the zirconias, I probably would do that with staining materials more than anything else, although I do have liners that can kind of handle that too. So you could use either, honestly. It really depends on which one you're more comfortable with. And I think the only thing I'll add to that, Jim, is if I'm doing a lingual zirconia, where it's full lingual, and I'm gonna put some materials on that facial, I will probably definitely add either a violet or a gray blue into the material around that incisal third of the tooth, again, to create the depth. So I'll cheat light a little bit by trying to make you to appear more translucent in that area.
All right. So if anybody has any last minute questions, please give them in. There is a comment here that you should write a book, which I agree. I try to get everyone, all my technician and dentist friends, to say, you know, put their knowledge on book, you know, copyright, whatever you want to do. But, you know, so obviously a lot of this is, we're losing it.
I'll cut you off and say, I have written a book. I haven't finished it yet. It's been in the works for 2 years. And my problem is every time I start sitting down to write it again, I feel like it's outdated and I start rewriting stuff. And that's part of the problem. I haven't finished it. And then the second part of that is I do have 2 books that are out that I have chapters in. They're up on the counter here. If you want, you guys can email me and I'll give you the information on those. But I do have chapters in 2 recent books that came out.
All right. No, fantastic. I mean, you know as well as I do that the concept of dental technology, pure dental technology, it's becoming lost. And we just need to capture it for future generations. Just a couple reminders. Those of you who are asking about CE, you should receive an email from the VITA Education in which you'll have to reply to ask for CE. Others that have asked about the recording, they are recorded, all of these webinars, so you can see Peter Pizzi. You can watch them all over again and as many times as you want online through our help desk, VITA, you know, Learning Center and so forth, off the internet, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and so forth. So please watch that. If you need any support from us internally, VITA support, here's a couple emails and some phone numbers that you can contact us direct. Of course, as Peter said, please email Peter.
Yeah, my email
whenever you
didn't
want.
come up for some reason, Jim, but I don't know why it didn't pop up on the screen, but it's my last name, Pizzi 7 at AOL, old school, so it's easy.
And I will, I'll put that on. Make sure next time. Also, there is VITA reps out there that can help you out as well. If you like Peter, which most of you all do, I haven't come across anyone who doesn't like Peter, and you want to see more of Peter, we've got several webinars scheduled out throughout the year on various topics. And I like this, Peter, because we're not doing repeats. These are all kind of unique webinars. It makes you work a lot harder.
Yes.
it keeps you from finishing that book as well.
You can see how late I was up last night trying to organize this.
Exactly. So, but please join us again for future webinars with Peter. These are the dates. Make sure you tune in. We've already done the questions. So, Peter, if you want to wrap up, any closing words on your side?
No, thank you, Joe. I'm sorry my email's not there. Again, my last name, Pizzi 7 at AOL.com. If you have any other questions or follow-throughs, feel free, or you can go through Jim or one of the local reps if that helps you. Thank you, guys. I'm always impressed that people, I saw like 180 people or something at one point. So really nice that everybody's still popping in for us for these, and I think it's great. I appreciate that. And any thoughts, comments, or critiques, feel free, and I'll try to always cater these more towards your needs than mine. So thank you guys for being here.
Well, thank you again, Peter, for another exciting webinar. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone that attended. Again, please look forward for some future webinars with Peter and other various webinars that we have. Please join us again. At this time, we'll say goodbye to Peter, and this will end
Take care,
today's VITA Learning webinar with Peter Pizzi. Thank you for attending.